takes pleasure in attracting a stellar list of speakers that address today's most relevant issues. The club's place as a refuge for rich discussion and networking has never wavered after 123 seasons.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Amanda Galbraith, and I'm an executive member of the Canadian Club of Toronto. Women's progress in politics reached a significant milestone with Kamala Harris's election as Vice President of the United States. However, it's also fair to say this progress brings us to a fork in the road. Would the election of Ms. Harris herald the greater acceptance of women leaders in the Western world? Or will the forces of populism and authoritarianism that promote a strongman paradigm of leadership prevail to the detriment of women's political leadership? Today, we're joined by a powerhouse panel of women politicians to discuss their advocacy for women and other represented groups in government, the ways in which they've paved the way for young, politically minded women to follow their lead, and the challenges they've had to overcome the adversity they still face. Before we dive into today's topic, here's some information about how to participate with us today. The click here to switch stream button helps if you find your internet is slow. The video quality may decrease, but the audio quality should remain strong. Once you click the questions tab, you can enter your questions in the window and they'll be sent to the moderator. Thank you to today's event sponsor, the Canadian Bankers Association. The Canadian Club is a nonprofit, and we've been gathering people together for 124 years. It is because of our sponsors that we can continue to do that. We are grateful for your support for today's discussion. Now, to introduce today's panelists. The Right Honourable Kim Campbell, Canada's 19th and first woman Prime Minister. The Honourable Bardish Chagger serves as the Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth and has served as Member of Parliament for Waterloo since 2015. And Annamie Paul, the newly elected leader of the Green Party of Canada. Today's panel will be moderated by Stephanie MacKendrick, author of In Good Hands, Remarkable Female Politicians from Around the World Who Showed Up, Spoke Out, and Made Change. After the event, all attendees will receive a discount code to purchase this great book, just in time for holiday gift giving. After Ms. MacKendrick's questions, I'll be back to ask the questions from the audience, so make sure to send them in. One of the Canadian Club's traditions that has not changed in this virtual world is the toast we make to our country, usually done in person with the raising of a glass. Let's make a nod towards the screen and toast to Canada. To Canada.
To Canada.
Ms. MacKendrick, I'll turn the Canadian Club podium over to you.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and thank you to all the panelists for taking the time to join me today on a very, very timely conversation about encouraging young women to think about running for elected office, and indeed, not just young women, but all women. When we started talking about this panel some time ago, we didn't yet know that we'd be celebrating the election of Kamala Harris as the Vice President-elect, as she is now, and the first woman in that role to be elected, and a woman of color. So our panelists are no strangers to breaking barrier themselves. They have all broken barriers in various ways. And first of all, the Right Honourable Kim Campbell. Ms. Campbell, of course, was Canada's first and so far, only Canadian Prime Minister. Minister Chagger was the first woman to be government House Leader at a very tender age of 36, I believe. and Ms. Paul as the first Black woman to be elected to lead a major national political party in Canada. Welcome to you all. We have a lot of ground to cover today and a lot of great things to talk about. We're going to try and keep it moving along and try to keep our questions short and our responses, around 2 minutes or under, so that we can really fully explore the topic. So I'm going to start with Ms. Campbell, if I may. When I interviewed you for the book, you talked about running for student council president because there had never been a woman who had run for president. And that was a pretty audacious move for a teen. Tell me what led you to make that decision, and how did that change your view of things?
Well, in fact, the year before, a girl had run, and she hadn't won. And a lot of people seem to say, well, girls can't be president. And I said, that's not right. So I wanted to run. And it's interesting because my mother raised my sister and me to believe that girls could do anything, but to understand that it wasn't a universally accepted proposition. And we were raised on Charlotte Whitton's wonderful comment, Charlotte Whitton, the first woman to be mayor of Ottawa, who used to say that a woman had to be twice as good as a man in order to be thought half as good, but that fortunately that was easy. But in those days, when I was a high school student, there was a lot of assumption that women just didn't belong, that girls couldn't do these things, women couldn't do these things. And I would say that in the course of my lifetime, that has changed dramatically. And I do want to make the point that even though we sometimes feel that we're pushing against something that's very difficult to move, if we remember the 2016 election in the United States, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 3 million. And 65 million Americans pulled the lever or put their X or poked their Chad for a woman as president. So I think it's very important for us not to allow setbacks to convince us that somehow there are no supporters of women out there. We've just heard that the Canadian Club gets pushback when they have programs about women. And there are always people out there who want to say no, they can't do it, or no, women don't belong. We do belong, and more people see it. So I just want to end my first comments by saying that there are a lot more people out there who are prepared to support women. Many of them are men who are totally convinced that women are going to save the world. I don't know if we have to save the world, but we certainly need to make our contribution. So whatever the difficulties, we shouldn't think that this is something that a lot of people don't get, because a lot of people do get it.
And I think that you've raised a really interesting point too about having to continue to push forward, and perseverance, which is something that we can explore a little later in the conversation. Minister Chagger, you entered post-secondary education with the idea of becoming a nurse, studying science and going into that field, but you've traveled down a different road. So you obviously came to a fork in the road very early in your life, and you ended up working first for another politician. And so how did that happen? How did you go from I'm going to study medicine and be a nurse to choosing a political career at a very young age?
So it was in grade 6 where I went to a day with the difference for at the University of Waterloo, where I got to see women in fields of science. And that's when I decided that I wanted to be a woman in science. And little did I realize that the people that were in the front of the room actually did not reflect the diversity that I encompassed. But all I did know is that I was a woman and these were women in a field that we needed to see more women. And politics has always been my hobby. So it went from wanting to nurse and the health of Canadians from coast to coast to coast to actually nursing the well-interest and the best interest of Canadians in a different way. So that's where politics was an opportunity. And I would have to agree with the Right Honourable Kim Campbell that there is an appetite to actually see more women in politics, to see more women in fields that we aren't always present in, just like we want to see more men be teachers and stay-at-home dads, and the list goes on. And it's really about like, how do we allow individuals to share their dreams and vision and be able to succeed? And I think that's the conversation our country's having right now. And just with the 2 recent by-elections, it was interesting to hear that with Yara and Marcy being elected, The House of Commons, 338 members of parliament from coast to coast to coast. And for the first time in the history of our country since Confederation, we have 100 women elected to the House of Commons. And so that's still less than 1/3 when women actually represent more than half of the population. So it tells us that these kind of conversations are really important and that women belong. And oftentimes, yes, we might have to fight harder, but we are more than capable of achieving this work. And I think it's really just about looking at who's at the decision-making table and how we create pathways for success for individuals and whatever they perceive as their own success.
Thank you. I think interesting that you've gone from in terms of women being underrepresented in science and looking at the health of people to the health of democracy, which is certainly part of this equation. Ms. Paul, I wanted to ask you, as I understand it, you started very early, probably not long after grade 6, as a page in the Ontario legislature at the age of 12. And you served as an intern for both the Conservative and Liberal parties around the age of 24 while you were at law school. And so is it safe to say that you always intended from very early to develop a career in politics?
Well, just a couple of, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation today. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm coming to you from the traditional territories of the Mississauga, Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, and the Mississauga, I think I said that, the Mississauga of the Credit, which I say with a lot of gratitude. Just a correction, I did the internships after law school. It was part of the Ontario Legislature Internship Program, which is a non-partisan program run by the Canadian Political Science Association. And so, no, those experiences were really more about understanding and appreciating the role of government in the creation of public policy. I really wanted to see how that was done. I wanted to, I understood it was important. I wanted to see exactly why. And that's really what I got out of both of those experiences. I developed very early a very deep appreciation for the work that is done at the various levels of government and the direct impact that it has on people's lives. So I didn't know that I would be doing this today, but I did know that I wanted to be part of affecting positive social change. And I do know that government is one avenue for that. So for me, being involved in politics now is really just an extension of all of the different kind of professional experiences I've had. It's really about trying to find impactful ways of effectuating positive change. And contrary to what some people in Canada think, and I understand why there's a lot of disillusionment about the political process, really important things still happen in government. And even more so, we saw that government was the first place that people turned to when the pandemic hit for help, for protection, for guidance. And so it's a very timely reminder of the importance of the role and exactly why we need more diversity. Because if you're developing public policy for a diverse population, then you want to make sure that you have that diversity of perspectives while you're formulating that public policy.
Thank you. That's really important. And maybe later on we could talk about another aspect you're involved in with the Canadian Centre for Political Leadership, which I think is certainly music to my ears, but everyone here. So I have a question for all of you. When my book came out earlier this year, I wrote an op-ed about the fact that what we had, I think 6 premiers, 6 provinces led by women at one point, we're down to 1. And, in a report based on 193 countries, to your point, Mr. Chagger, Canada ranks 59th. We're ahead of the US, which is 78th, but we're sort of between Albania and Estonia. So, we are making progress. I think we've already, established that we have 100 women in the House for the first time. But why does it still seem to be such a difficult balance to redress? I guess I should say imbalance to redress. And I'll start with you, Ms. Campbell, if I could.
Well, I wish I knew the answer. I mean, it's complicated in ways that For example, raising money, that women are often loath to ask people for money. They're often not sophisticated about doing that. Women often are socialized in a very different way in terms of tooting their own horn. And if you want people to vote for you, you have to tell them why they should vote for you. So there are a lot of cultural things that do that. But I think it's also important to remember that politics is about power. And, when people feel they have sort of a privileged access to power, they don't necessarily want to give it up. And also, if you look or sound different from others who have done the job before, you may find that people who are part of the quote establishment find it hard to accept you. And I found this, particularly with the Ottawa Press Gallery. I found with the media that the worst media were the Ottawa Press Gallery, because I didn't look or sound like anyone who'd been prime minister before. And one reporter sort of, this lip curled, sort of said to me, I've known every prime minister since Lester Pearson. And the implication was, and you're no Lester Pearson. And I think, well, no, I'm not. And isn't that a good thing? Because by that time he was dead, and it would have been unfortunate as prime minister. But anyway, but the point is that people, they think they own the system. And you have to change the landscape from which people get their sense of how the world works. And I think we're getting to be able to do that more. But the other thing I would also say is that there are some things in Canada. I was the member of Parliament for Vancouver Centre, which is a 5-hour plane ride from Ottawa. And in fact, when I was member of Parliament, there was no direct flight between Vancouver and Ottawa, if you can imagine. So you had to go through Calgary, you had to go through Toronto. So the physical logistics of serving nationally in our country are often very difficult. I encourage people to serve locally, because it gets you sort of to understand whether in fact you have the temperament for politics, and you don't have to go somewhere else to do it. But I think in a big country like Canada, you often have some structural and logistical challenges that make it hard for women who often have to accommodate other demands. When I was elected, Mary Collins and I went into cabinet right away. Neither of us had children. I was married, she was divorced, but our personal lives made it much easier for us to manage that tension between having to be in Ottawa and having to be in Vancouver. So a lot of those things count also, which is why it is very important to structure legislative bodies in a way that are friendly to people who are raising families or have other kinds of obligations, that this is the reality. I think the vast majority of men who serve in the American Congress have wives who don't work. Now, that provides a certain lack of perspective, I think, on the reality of life that a lot of women and a lot of people live. So I think we need to look at the structural things that may get in the way of women feeling comfortable disrupting their lives to take on political office.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. There are practical realities that land differently, I think, for women and men. And when I was doing interviews, Kirsten Gillibrand, the U.S. Senator, brought her baby and created a furor because she was, wanted a room to be able to nurse the baby. Joe Swinson in the UK. There's just so many situations where those structures do make a difference. So, Ms. Paul, I'll ask you the same thing. What's your perspective in terms of why is it so tough, and how are we doing?
Before I get to the nuts and bolts, I will say that was very evocative what you just said, because when I was a graduate student at Princeton when my first son was born, and I didn't ask permission. I just brought him to class. I breastfed him all over the place. I had so many professors, just male professors, just looking up to the sky while I was feeding my son. And that was really it. I knew that if I asked them, that they would say no, and I wasn't going to make the choice between doing one or the other. And with respect to Ms. Campbell's comment, she's absolutely right. We need to change the structures, and we shouldn't view that as a weakness or compromise. These were not designed with the interests of women at all. I mean, they were designed at a time when we weren't involved in politics. And if we have these barriers to access, we all lose out, because we need the intellectual capital that women bring to the table, particularly at this moment. And so if we can eliminate barriers that make it easier for women to participate, then we absolutely should do that. It's a good thing for all of us. We know, and coming back to the Canadian Centre for Political Leadership, which I founded and ran through the early 2000s, it was all about that, about really understanding what were the barriers and how we could deconstruct them or overcome them, because sometimes you just can't wait for them to go away. You still have to go ahead. There is no question, as Ms. Campbell said, money, having access to, let's say, the resources, both financial and human, that allow you to successfully run is still a barrier for women. The expression, I think Kamala Harris has been saying that quite a lot lately, and it's something that I say too. It's hard to be what you can't see. And so we know, again, empirically, that when you're not reflected in an institution, you tend not to associate yourself with it. You tend not to be able to project yourself mentally into it. And so women, very accomplished women, still don't even consider running. And they need to be asked many more times than men before they do run. So these are, I mean, I could go on. There is a great body of evidence that is out there, comparative evidence as well across different countries, about the barriers for women. All of them are overcomable. And it is important to know that in the context of Canada, women are more electable than men. So if you put a woman in a winnable riding, they have a better chance of winning than their male counterpart. So that is the good news. And it's something to build from.
I think that's a really interesting point, because I don't think most people are aware of that fact. They probably would believe that it's a much steeper challenge for women to be elected in a key point winnable riding. And I think it's interesting your point too about, to Ms. Campbell's point, you can't wait for people to invite you in and say, oh, we'd like you to come in. You have to take power. You did in this situation with Princeton. You didn't ask permission, you just went ahead. And I think that is an absolutely key point. So, Minister Chagger, what's on your top 10 in terms of the some of the challenges we face and how we approach them?
So I've been actually looking a lot into the history of the country, and I think it's really important that we do acknowledge the land on which we're on. So I'm joining you from Waterloo, Ontario, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe neutral people. And I think oftentimes we've actually not known the true history of our country, and it's important that we actually get to know where we've come from so we have a clearer vision as to where we're going. I look at the 36 individuals that were negotiating Confederation. And when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says in Canada, diversity is our strength, he's not just talking about the shells that we occupy, but he is talking about the diversity of gender, of regions, of experiences, perspectives, and the list goes on. And I think one way of ensuring that we actually have more equitable access is ensuring that that decision-making table is more representative of our country. And we've not done that well. Yes, our government has brought in an open, transparent, merit-based appointment process. We've seen more women be appointed to the bench. But when I was named Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth, what I was recognizing was also that there wasn't a lot of women that looked like me that were being necessarily appointed to these opportunities. And even when it comes to the voices of youth, when we pass legislation, it's the young people of our country who are most impacted by it. So it's important that they also have a voice at the decision-making table. And if that table cannot transform overnight, at minimum has to be informed by the lived experiences. And when we have these conversations, oftentimes people will think that's about taking something away. It's not about taking something away. It's actually about creating more space for more voices to be heard and to have a more respectful debate so that we actually recognize the pathway to achieving true inclusion in our country. And it's about creating conditions for success. And I think that's where our government and our country is having that tough conversation as to how do we come out of this pandemic, where are the realities of certain segments, and the fact that, yes, the whole world has been impacted by COVID-19 and all Canadians have been impacted by COVID-19, but disproportionately certain segments. And so how do we ensure that we actually are mindful of that? And how do we actually enable and not only empower, but enable individuals to help build this country that we want to see? So I entirely agree with the whole concept of power. And I think that's what politics and government has always been about, is about obtaining power. But for myself, I was elected. Yes, I am a proud Liberal, but once I was elected, it's my job to represent all voices within my community. And as a Minister of the Crown, it's my job to ensure that I am, engaging with my stakeholders from coast to coast to coast. And when it's also my job to look at who's not being represented. And so I need to actually look at how do I bring those voices to the table, or how do I create more inclusive spaces? And that's why when we talk about gender, I also talk about people who don't identify as male or female. And so how do we actually get to a place where people are treated as people and are able to actually realize their potential?
Thank you.
Can I make a comment too, just to pull that part of getting there is who's in control of the narrative. Power is very much reflected in who controls the narrative. And one of the things that we're seeing in the United States with the incredible, the whole thing that George Floyd's murder has created, is people really focusing on the fact that the narrative in many parts of the United States is incredibly distorted. When the Daughters of the Confederacy started to want to rewrite the history books so that people learn about the Civil War as if it had nothing to do with slavery, and and taking down statues of people, all of these kinds of things. And I think if we start with women in Canada, the history of women in Canada is not a history that we're told. That if you are an anomaly, if people don't expect you to be there, your story falls off the table. And yet women have been incredible. And in fact, women in First Nations, First Nations women played an essential role in as liaisons between the original, the Hudson's Bay factors and the First Nations communities, and in the early development of the pre-colonial, the colonial economy or pre-colonial economy. I mean, all these women have been doing things. They are smart. If you go on the website of the Perimeter Institute and you'll look at their thing on women in science, we don't learn about these women because people think, oh, women don't do this, so we don't have to learn about them. And we will never have a more inclusive future and fair and just future if we don't have a more inclusive and fair and just history. And that means recognizing the role that people who don't get to be in the history books played. And it's not making something up. It's rediscovering it, because that's part of where the discrimination comes from, with people saying, well, we look at the history of this country and you're kind of late comers. No, you're not. And even the very controversial Sir John A. Macdonald believed that women should have the vote. So the idea of the enfranchisement of women is nothing new. And but so many other relationships, people of color, First Nations people, all of these things, we don't know their histories. We're told something different. And that's something, and for me, my struggle for gender equality has been the portal through which I have entered these other areas and come to understand the profundity of my own ignorance about other Canadians and other Canadian lives. And I think we all have to commit ourselves to opening up that narrative and giving people their right place, because that's then what creates the landscape of who belongs and who gets to do stuff and why exclusion is so incredibly unjust.
That's a really, really important point. I think the narrative is crucial because, and it's role models. It's not seeing yourself. How do you model for inclusion if people who are telling the stories, who are holding the power, do not represent the people out there? And I think this whole question of role models and mentorship, which I think is something that is critical for everyone, but I think for women it can be tough, and it can be especially tough if you don't see role models that you can relate to, and it if there's a role model in a position of power, it instantly becomes starts to become anyway normalized and seen as achievable. I wanted to explore a little bit about role models, and if we could ask each of you to describe someone who made an impact, who was either a role model, and I think who changed your view or opened that window for you. So we'll start with Minister Chagger and go to Ms. Paul and then Ms. Campbell.
Thank you. So and you alluded to it in my comments, I worked for the Honorable Andrew Chagger. He was the Member of Parliament for the riding of Waterloo, and he also served as Parliamentary Secretary to Indigenous Affairs under Prime Minister Paul Martin. And I worked for him after I graduated University of Waterloo, obtaining my Bachelor of Science. And I loved politics since I was 13 years old. And I'm the child of the Charter. And I love telling young people that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is actually younger than I am. And it just tells us how recent these rights and freedoms are. And with rights and freedoms come responsibilities. So little did I realize that he was actually kind of taking me under his wing and providing me opportunities and guiding me through this process. And when the nomination opened in the riding of Waterloo, he was the individual who said, you need to put your name forward. But an individual like me has never run in the riding of Waterloo or been elected as a member of parliament. And so I had never seen it. So how do you be it when you've never seen it? And I think that's where mentorship is very important. And I think mentorship comes in many different ways. And so I was really pleased to see the good people of the riding of Waterloo provide me their confidence to represent them and to send me back again in 2019. But I am the first woman, and I would say only woman, elected in the riding of Waterloo. And I look forward to seeing others. And I think just to the earlier comments, the picture of the Right Honorable Kim Campbell, and I'll always say that because she is the only woman to have actually sat in the seat of Prime Minister as a woman in Canada. And so it's my favorite picture to take people to when I'm in the hallways on Parliament Hill. And people will talk about partisanship and say, well, she's not the same party, but she's a Canadian and I'm a Canadian. And what kind of Canada do we want? And I think that's where, this discourse that we're having is really instrumental. So I would say a mentor of mine is Andrew Chagger. He's no longer with us, but everything he's taught me walks with me in my journeys. And sometimes I take his advice and sometimes I try to find a different way. And I think that's part of learning. But also mentors in my life are actually the young people of this country. When we were talking about socially distancing because of COVID-19, it was young people who were saying, no, we need to physically distance. Like you need to keep 6 feet distance, you need to wear your mask, you need to wash your hands, but socially we can be connected through the use of technology. And it was young people who actually bridged the intergenerational gap by dropping off tablets to their grandparents and loved ones to say, I'm going to FaceTime you and I'm going to connect with you so that we can stay socially connected, but physically we need to be apart because the health and safety of all Canadians is a priority.
Yeah, it's the role models are critical, and I'm glad that you mentioned the role model. I think Ms. Campbell, you're at the top of the hit parade for so many of us.
The only one.
So, Ms. Paul, can you can you think of someone a female role model or someone who helped you understand that it is possible to hold a position of power?
Well, my mother came from this very interesting generation of Caribbean women. It's interesting. There are a few women, her included, that became school teachers here in Canada, coming from the Caribbean, and they, not in my mother's case, but in their cases, they went on to run for politics successfully and become first. And they're all exactly the same age, and my mom knows them all. Because they were part of the same cohort in Toronto. So Zanena Conde and Jean Augustine, these were 2 women that my mom knew growing up, and they gave me a very clear sense very early on that there didn't have to be any limits. And when you have women like that doing what they all accomplished, they were first. It was never something that seemed out of reach to me. So, and I really thank them for that quite a lot. And my mother too. My mother had the expectations that we could do quite a lot, and she was right. But it really was almost taken as a given, and that was very empowering. And then I would say that lately, because I wouldn't say I have one model, but lately certainly I think a lot about the people that came together to help me to win the leadership race, because did we lose our?
I say keep going because I want to hear what you're saying.
Okay. Anyways, they came together to do something that had never been done before. If I was going to be elected, it was going to be as many first: the first Black person, the first Jewish woman, the first woman of color to lead a major federal party. And so they all went into this believing that something that had not previously been possible was possible. And I can't imagine anything more inspiring than that. And they came together across the country, just all demographics, really, age and gender identity and ethnicity, socioeconomic status. And so for me, that is incredibly inspiring. I try to keep my mind fixed on that because we really are living in a moment where we have got to believe that things that we previously thought were not possible are indeed possible. And so every time people come together and say, yes, we know we can still do that, it's very inspiring to me. So the team, I would say, is my model at the moment. And I take a lot of inspiration from them.
I think you're muted.
Sorry, I had the message that your computer is about to go to sleep unless I plugged it in. I had a bad connection. I'm sorry. So if you wouldn't mind, Ms. Campbell, we've been hearing some really interesting ways of breaking through that idea that it's impossible. It's not impossible. It is possible. You grew up in an earlier time when female role models were pretty thin on the ground, I would say. So how did you, were there role models in your own life, or was there something that enabled you to push through? I think you referred to your being raised with no limitations, which is a huge, I think, benefit to start with.
And when I was young, women were often actually competitive with one another. When you don't think that there are places for every able woman, that makes you a competitor with every other able woman. And it's interesting because when I was young, I thought that, that I was smart and I could do everything, but I wasn't sure about the others. And it was only when I got into my 20s, 30s, I realized, you know what, I'm not the smartest girl around. And there's a lot more smart like me. And as I got very involved doing things, and particularly things around the world, and particularly in my post-political career, I continue to acquire role models, women who are doing heroic and amazing things all around the world. I remember once at the Club of Madrid, we did a project on women in peace and security in the Horn of Africa, working with a group of women who led networks in their own countries in the Horn of Africa, living under incredible danger. And the fact that our organization, and our male members and presidents and prime ministers in the Club of Madrid, were very keen to work with them as well. But I would think to myself, when I was in politics, I never had to fear for my life. I might have worried about the slings and arrows of outrageous journalists, but I knew that whatever happened, I was going to survive. And here are women who are putting their lives on the line to try and advocate for the inclusion of women in peace negotiations and things like that. I look at the things that women are doing, the people who are demonstrating now in Poland, people who do things where they actually put their lives and security on the line. So I continue to be inspired, and not just by women, but also by men. I guess every time I encounter people who are decent and who believe in underlying values and who care about other people in society and are prepared to put themselves on the line for that, that's a role model for me, and that gives me strength and courage, because it's very difficult times. I was a Soviet specialist in my youth, so you can imagine, how I feel about the resurgent authoritarianism fostered by Vladimir Putin, and all that entails. I worry a lot, but the antidote to that worry is beauty, and all that entails. But the beauty of human beings who really do have courage and don't give in. So my life is full of role models, and I'm continuing to acquire them. And I'm sitting here looking at some pretty good suspects right here in this program.
Thank you so much. One of the, I think the most rewarding aspects of writing the book that I did was interviewing women who had faced all sorts of a whole entire range of different situations. And one of the most in the interview that had one of the most life-changing, I guess, really big impact on me was interviewing Cori Bush, who has just been elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and it's her third try at getting elected. And what she went through was horrific. She was a nurse who became just, briefly became involved in the activism in Ferguson, Missouri after the death of Michael Brown at the hands of police. And she started as a nurse just helping take care of the protesters and ended up being an activist herself. She's been, threatened verbally, physically, sexually. She has been through things I can't imagine, honestly. And she had the courage, the perseverance to come back at it. I asked her, I said, where do you get the courage? And she said, and I thought it was extraordinary. She said, I'm more afraid of what will happen if I don't run than what will happen if I do. And she had a 19-year-old son at the time who she said, what's going to happen to him if I can't find it within myself to run? And so I thought, one of the things that we might turn to now is, the courage it requires, but also, there are exceptions. There are women who are exceptions. I think Margaret Thatcher, Ms. Campbell, you had pointed out, she was kind of a standalone, perhaps a unicorn. And we now have Kamala Harris. And that's a huge step forward. And as you say, again, Ms. Campbell, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. It wasn't that she wasn't electable, it was all sorts of other things. So how do we make this from an exception? We had 6 women premiers, we've got 1. How do we make this sustainable change in a different environment rather than an exception? And Ms. Paul, I'll maybe start with you this time.
Yes, that is a big question, and I don't know if we fully have the answer, because it's important to underline, it has been a couple of times already in this conversation, that we cannot take for granted that any of these advances are permanent. We did have a moment where we had quite a few premiers who were women, and now we have only 1 out of the 13 provinces and territories. We've only had 5 women that have led a major federal party. And if you subtract myself and Elizabeth May, we haven't had one for over 20 years. And so there is no question that every time someone like myself gets elected, or like our other panelists is elected, it helps. It absolutely does help, but it's not enough in and of itself. I think one of the big challenges now is really the culture of politics, which was never great. It was never great, but it's pretty awful now. I mean, first of all, running, and particularly if you're running at the highest levels, I'll focus on that. It's really a blood sport. It actually requires a certain amount of privilege, because you really have to dedicate a year or 2 or 3, or in the case of the United States, I mean, decades of your life planning out a critical pathway towards success. Social media has made things so much worse, and women politicians are particularly subject to attacks. There are people studying this, and I'm sure some of that research will be made public. But I mean, if you look at the politicians who are most consistently subject to hate attacks online, they're women. And so a lot of women, particularly accomplished women, are just going to say, I don't need that. I mean, yep.
I would just, sorry to interrupt.
Please.
What would you say to them? Because I think this comes up a lot, and it was a question that I asked, in my interviews. It's, there has to be a way to deal with it, because if we conclude that it will stop people, the good people, women, but also, the men that we want to have involved in politics for the right reasons, how do we deal with it?
Well, there has to be a certain amount of personal accountability. I absolutely am supportive of increased regulation of social media companies, absolutely. But there has to be a certain amount of self-policing. There has to be a certain amount of personal accountability. We're not going to be able to stop everything through regulation alone. And there has to be just less acceptance that it has to remain this way. And again, we've touched on that during this discussion. There is nothing inherently good or essential about the way that we conduct politics and the culture of politics in this country. And so, you do an audit. You do an audit of our political culture or structures, and then we say what should be kept, what should be dismantled, what is creating barriers. It has to be. It's a systemic problem, and so it really requires systemic solutions.
That's a really important point. Ms. Campbell, did you want to just chime in on that one?
Well, I think we have to learn new ways of supporting people once they're in office. I think Annamie is right that social media has really brought in a whole new, I think because it creates tribes. I mean, we've always had, terrible coverage and when you're a minister, you get this brick of the national press that's covering it, and you see what people are writing in all different kinds of newspapers and things. But what the problem with social media is that you don't necessarily see, and that there are all these things going on and conspiracy theories and things that can make it very difficult. So I think we have to really rally around and be very supportive. And I think it's important for women, though, to understand that it does make a difference, that the presence of women at the table, even as we talk about the effects of social media and some of the effects of the things that are happening to people in politics, if women are not around the table to voice those concerns and to share the kinds of things that they're getting, because I think men are often really rather surprised. Men don't always see it. It's like when Larry Summers made the comment about women in science, and the New York Times had an article about the professor at Michigan who was asked to sit on a panel to get more women in science, and he said, "Oh, it's just the old guys, and it'll go away generationally." And then he went to a presentation on the bias against women in science, and he was gobsmacked. It never occurred to him that panels of women and men together, would require a female candidate to have 2.5 times as many publications as a male to be considered equal. So a lot of this privilege, a lot of this is invisible to men, and it's not because they're bad. It's that they just don't see it, and all of us do. And I have found this even in myself in the course of my life. So I think we have to really communicate to women that it matters that they're there, that the reality of life as it is lived by women is an integral foundation on which to make public policy. And no one woman can represent all women, no matter how much you try, and you obviously you go out and you meet people and you try to learn about your constituents, but you cannot encompass all of those lived experiences. So until we have that diversity, it will be a disaster. But women need to know that it matters. It's not just window dressing. It's not just fluff. It is integral to true democracy that they be part of the decision-making process.
I'm just going to jump in here now because we've got quite a few questions from our audience. So we'll try and get to as many of those as possible. So the first one sort of touches on some themes actually that Ms. Paul even spoke about, and I think Ms. Chagger as well. But a major deterrent for many women running for government is the challenge of balancing caregiver responsibilities and the requirement to spend significant amounts of time away from home if elected. The pandemic has changed how Parliament operates. Do you think the remote participation in debates and electronic voting will be acceptable post-pandemic and enable more women to put their name on a ballot? I'm going to throw that to Minister Chagger first because she's in Parliament voting remotely and all those kinds of things. So do you think that this change we've seen will stay and that we will see more women run for office as a result?
Amanda, I would say that living with the virus, I think, is our new reality. And yes, the vaccine is really exciting, but we also don't know what that means, because as a government that bases their decisions on science over ideology, we need to see what that science looks like. So I actually think there is a transformation taking place. When it comes to remote voting, it's something that our government's been trying to push for since we took to office in 2015 to actually make it more inclusive. But I think part of that decision also is about lifting those voices up. So oftentimes we see individuals have had caregiver responsibilities and then have been able to overcome them with the current system. And because they're not in that situation anymore, they say, well, I've been able to do it, so someone else should be able to. But the reality is that you never should have had to decide. And being a care provider, and whatever that looks like, is important. I personally don't have kids, but I do believe that communities raise children. But I do have loved ones that also require care that I want to be there for. And so I think that's why the decision-making table and, at minimum, the lived experiences of individuals have to inform the decisions. And I think electronic voting, even if it is a trial basis, we should give it a go because other countries are doing it. And we can use technology for good. The country is massive. And, Ms. Campbell alluded to the fact that there was no direct flight from BC to Ottawa. And that should not be a deterrent. We should actually recognize the opportunities as well as the challenges, strengths and weaknesses of our country. And then how do we overcome them to ensure that we lift those voices up? And I think that's where this conversation is not done yet. And if people have perspectives, when I was a government House leader, I got slaughtered for wanting to put out a discussion paper about actually modernizing the way the House of Commons works. And it was distracted from the actual conversation. So I actually think democracy, the power of the people have to step up and have their voices heard so that we actually represent you in the House of Commons or any legislative assembly across the country. But I think it's totally possible.
Awesome. Well, good news. I would love to see more of that for sure. Prime Minister Campbell.
Can I just add maybe something about that and just say that while there's no doubt that having remote voting will allow those in remote constituencies to spend more time in them and to spend more time close to their families, it also can create a 24-hour work day as well. This technology has been essential during the pandemic, but it has not liberated us. And I think it's also important to be very honest with anyone who's thinking about running for office, particularly as a member of parliament or leading a party, that it really is you have to view it as a vocation and perhaps something that you only do for a set period of time in your life. But unless there are profound, to say radical changes to our existing political system and cultures, then there is no possibility of balance. In my case, I have 2 children, but they're out, they're launched, let's say they're out of the house. I had them quite young. Thank you to my husband for that. It was the best suggestion he ever gave me. But I could not have, there's no way that I could do what I am doing, even with Zoom and remote technology, and at the same time, really be there for them in any meaningful way, had they been younger. There is no way I could have designed this. And so that is, I think it's very important to be honest with women when they're thinking about this, about the choices that they inevitably are going to have to make, some of which are very unpleasant. And I do believe unnecessary, but really unavoidable unless we radically change our system.
But can I just say that it's not just women. When I was in Parliament, we changed the rule.
That's true.
1 week in 4 we didn't sit, which meant if you came from Vancouver, you could actually get out for a whole week into your constituency. But we also did away with night sittings. And, men, they didn't want to sit all night, drinking and playing cards, waiting for a vote. They wanted to go home to their families. So all of these things that humanize the experience of serving in public office, humanize it for men too. And there's some interesting discussion about how the COVID experience is changing parenting because more fathers being involved. So I think it's very important to not to say we're doing this so that the girls can serve. No, we're doing this because men and women want to live normal lives. We're not doing it as any favor to the ladies. I use those expressions in quotation marks because I don't.
Perfect. Prime Minister Campbell, you were elected as Canada's first female prime minister as a Conservative. The question here is, do you think there's an assumption that all women in politics automatically support left-wing social justice viewpoints? Or is it possible to actually not be defined by one's gender or as a female Conservative?
Well, I think if you look at women political leaders, they come from all different parties and all different persuasions. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, it was not Angela Merkel. Although Angela Merkel's not a left-winger particularly, she runs a Christian Democratic Union. And incidentally, I think she's wonderful because she just defies all of the expectations people had about women leaders. She doesn't have children and she doesn't wear skirts, and she's considered one of the most respected leaders, not just in her own country, but in the world, which is a 70% approval rating. So I think the women come in all different sizes, shapes, and colors, and they don't all have the same views. The Republicans, who have gone, very much farther right than I would ever have been, have elected, I think, 30 more women in their caucus in Congress this last election, which I think is great. I don't agree with every woman who's in public life, but the fact of there being women and bringing their particular perspective is very helpful. So I think that although I think that as I get older, I sort of think I've always been in the same place. I guess I've always been kind of a red Tory, and the Conservative Party went sort of way over there, and other people go way over there. I'm sort of still where I always was, so I don't know what label you put on it, but.
So this last question, before we wrap up, we'll go to all of you, but I'm going to start with Ms. Paul. I voted for Annamie in the recent by-election. The results have spurred me to make my first financial contribution for a political cause. Can all of the panelists recommend where people can direct their dollars to have the biggest impact, i.e. federal, provincial parties, not-for-profits, supporting women in politics, or something else? So Annamie, why don't we start first with you, given that you were the cause for this whole question?
First of all, thank you, and whomever sent that question. It was very appreciated. We did really well, and I know that it was probably the first time, as you said, that you had voted Green. So thank you very much. And it's a great question to me to have people say to me when the leadership of our party became available, Annamie, you should consider doing this. I see something in you. I see leadership in you. But what was, I would say, even more important and really probably the tipping point in helping me to decide to run were the people who said what this, the questioner, said what this questioner said, which is that, how can I help you financially? Financial considerations are a huge barrier. And so the people who said to me, not only do I think you should do this, but I will show up. I will help you raise money. I will help you find volunteers. I will help you organize your team. I will give you some of my time. Those were the things that really made a difference. So I would encourage this person to think about the issues that matter most to them in their community, in their lives. Find the level of government that corresponds the most to that and the party that reflects those values, and then support them, and every little bit matters. Or alternatively, you may just find someone who's really inspiring to you. I know that there are people who've never been Green before who voted for me and who've donated to support me. Just do it, and then find 2 more people that are willing to give $10 a month as well. I will say though that time is more valuable than money, and any political party, any politician will tell you that 10 hours of your time is worth way more than $100. And so just find the ways that you can support women in particular. And I will say that it makes such a difference, particularly to women thinking about politics, to know that they're going to have the tangible support they need to run successful campaigns. It really made all the difference to me.
Perfect. Minister Chagger, I'll give you a minute, then I'll also give Prime Minister Campbell a minute, and then we'll wrap up.
So I would echo the comments, but I would say that there's no wrong way. Every way is a right way to get involved. So whether that's making a donation, whether that's volunteering, whether that's joining a board, whether that's starting a petition, signing a petition, the list goes on. Democracy has no limits, and each individual has the ability to participate. And I think as we have those opportunities, we also need to look at who does not have those opportunities. So the question about online voting and so forth, I started thinking about when Annamie was talking, what about people who don't have access to the internet? Are they not able to participate? So how do we make sure that their voices are also lifted up and that we fight for them? And I think that's where get involved in any which way you can. I had a young person involved in my campaign, and he said, well, I'm not a liberal, but I like you. And I said, you don't have to be a liberal. Like in Canada, if you're 18 years of age and a Canadian citizen, you can start your own party. So whatever is important to you is really what matters. And I think what we shouldn't do is actually define another generation to say you have to be okay with the status quo. Let's shake shake things up and actually make sure that we are building that Canada that we believe in. Every individual should be able to participate in any which way they can. The best experience I ever received was actually by volunteering on boards, and by being on those boards. And oftentimes it was not a call to action for me, but it was me sending a message and saying, hey, can I be on your board? Having that opportunity, and it created and opened up numerous other opportunities. And so what I try to do is, as I'm so grateful to the people who came before me, is to continue laying track for the people who walk with me and come after me, to ensure that I'm not the only, but the first, because I want to see other women and other individuals, including gender diverse individuals, in these roles. And I want to know that you belong. And it's absolutely correct. It is not a beautiful experience all the time. And what you hear as the public is oftentimes the worst of it. But there are many opportunities and benefits that come with it. So if I can ever be available to you, do not hesitate to reach out to my office. I would love a 20-minute conversation or whatever it requires to get into the real deal, but also to share with you oftentimes what is not shared. So get involved in any which way you want to. You define your own success. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be with you today.
Okay, about 30 seconds left from Mr. Campbell. You can wrap it up here.
Well, I'm a daughter of 2 war veterans, and this last week I went and laid a wreath for Canada at the Commonwealth War Grave in Florence here in Italy. There are 50 Canadians who lie there. My father's best friend is buried in Ravenna. My dad fought and was wounded in Italy during the war. The price that has been paid for us to be able to create democracy is enormous. And when you look at those graves of people in their 20s, and you think, none of us, I see this when I look at people demonstrating in Russia. I was a Soviet specialist, and I watched these people put their lives on the line in Belarus and in Moscow. And I think, I'm so lucky that I don't ever have to be that brave. It's not very hard to be a citizen in our country. Just step up, vote, write a check, engage and care. Because if you don't do that, you just watch the news and you'll see what happens when you don't care about it. So, and women are integral. And the Pew Research has said that the best indication of the social, political, and economic status of a country, the condition of a country, is the status of its women. So, sorry, sisters, you're an integral part of that formula. So we need to support you. We need to get you involved, because the alternative is really unthinkable. And I'm old enough to have seen and to know what that is, and it scares the wits out of me. And I think women have a unique role to play in making sure that those terrible eventualities don't happen. So go for it.
I want to say amen.
Perfect. Okay, well, that went very quickly. So thanks for engaging us all of our listeners and viewers online today. Ms. Paul, Minister Chagger, Ms. Campbell, thank you for taking the time to share experiences and your wisdom, and with all the young women and individuals listening from home. And Ms. MacKendrick, thank you for your guidance in today's conversation, and thank you for writing such an important book for young women around the world. We hope you'll join us for some of our upcoming events. Next Tuesday, November 24th, we'll host the Honorable Ralph Goodale as he accepts the Churchill Society's 37th Annual Award of Excellence. He'll be joined in conversation by David Hurley of the Hurley Burley podcast. You don't want to miss it. And on Wednesday, November 25th, we're joined by Canada's Commissioner of Competition, Matthew Boswell. Thank you again to the Canadian Bankers Association for sponsoring today's event. Our event would not be possible without our sponsors, so thank you for your continued generosity. Thank you to our IV supplier, Van Valkenburg Communications and LiveMeeting.ca, for making it possible for us to come together today virtually. Guests, thank you for joining us. Look for our follow-up survey and our discount code for In Good Hands later today. Please stay safe and healthy.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.